Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Manda Hadley podcast, the podcast that delves into the fascinating world of law and helps you navigate its complexities. Today, I'm joined by Stuart Daniel, the head of family law here at Manda Hadley Solicitors, and we'll be discussing the ins and outs of prenups. Now, you may or may not be familiar with what prenups actually are. I'm not going to go into any detail. I'm going to let Stuart explain all of that. But what we want to try and get out of this podcast is some of the common misconceptions around prenup agreements and also explore their importance in the modern era. So hello, Stuart, how are you?
Morning, Joe. Good, thanks yourself.
Yeah, very well, thank you. So can I just ask you just to introduce yourself in case anybody hasn't heard our podcast before and just cover your expertise in the field of family law and in particular in prenup agreements?
Sure. So for my sins, I've been doing family law now for nearly 17 years. I joined private practice in 2004, so nearly 20 years ago. And after my apprenticeship or training contract, I specialised in family law pretty much straight away. So 17-ish years of family law experience. I did my first prenup within a year of qualifying, so many, many years ago. And I've seen a sort of increase in interest for them in the last sort of year or so, particularly. So done more prenups the last couple of years, but have been doing them for nigh on 17 years now.
So for our listeners who might be unfamiliar with what a prenuptial agreement is, what is it? And perhaps you could also explain what a postnuptial agreement is at the same time.
Yeah. Effectively, it's trying to govern what would happen to the financial assets of a marriage in the event of divorce. If you don't have a prenup, then ultimately someone else is going to decide for you how the assets are divided, a judge, a mediator, a solicitor, perhaps. With a prenup, it's about the couple taking control as to what would happen if, hopefully not, but if they do divorce. And that's really the sort of benefits of a prenup. A postnup is effectively the same agreement, but after they've got married.
And what are the main reasons that people choose to enter into these agreements?
I would say the sort of trends I see, typically couples looking to marry later in life, where they've perhaps built up assets from beforehand that weren't accumulated together. Couples who've been divorced before or gone through relationship breakdown before, and particularly with their children. It's similar to inheritance planning. It's making sure children from past relationships don't become disinherited in the event of a divorce a second time around. So those are the classic reasons I would say people choose to enter into these agreements.
Because I guess my preconception of prenuptial agreements is they're only for the rich.
I think that's probably true traditionally. I think there's been more interest in Middle England in the last sort of 5-10 years as case law's developed. But typically the cases that come before the courts are the very wealthy. So that's where the preconception comes from. But I'm seeing more inquiries from day-to-day people who are in those categories, marrying later in life. They've built up assets they want to protect. They've got children from past relationships, etc. So no, I don't think it's true anymore to say they're just for the rich.
So how exactly do these agreements work then, Stuart, in England and Wales, and are they legally binding?
The last question, first of all, the short answer is no. They're not guaranteed to be upheld. However, they've become more influential. 10-15 years ago, I think it's fair to say that they sort of carried little weight. That's changed over time. And to sort of give you some practical insight, if I'm acting for a client now going through divorce and they're trying to sort out the finances, one of the first questions the courts will ask them in the pro forma we upload to the court system is, are any arguments being raised about prenups? So from the word go, the courts are asking the question, have you got a prenup? Do you want to rely upon it? So it's very much at the forefront now.
Okay. And just sort of moving on from that point particularly, are there any specific criteria that need to be met for a prenuptial agreement to be considered valid and enforceable in the eyes of the law?
Definitely. One of the key things is to have financial disclosure. That's the bedrock of negotiation. So if you don't declare your assets, you can't seek to protect them later on. Anyone worth their salt will say to clients wanting to enter into prenup that you must have full and frank disclosure, disclose your property, your capital, your bank accounts, you pay everything effectively. That's one key ingredient. The second is you both have legal advice. It's no good one party having legal advice as being self-representing. They need to have essential legal advice. I would refuse to do a prenup if the other party wasn't represented, just to illustrate the point and how important it is. The other key consideration is meeting needs. particularly, and this comes on to a point we'll discuss later, no doubt, particularly where children are involved or are going to be involved in subsequent years. You must consider reasonable needs when going into a prenup. If you separate, where you're both going to live, how are children going to be provided for? Those are the key considerations. And I would say if you don't address needs at the point of doing your prenup, it's less likely to be upheld later on. So that's an absolute must, to consider basic needs and those of children in particular.
And I guess that's the examples you'd give in the types of provisions that are typically included in these agreements.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
ring fencing. Yeah. Okay. All right. In your experience then, Stuart, what are some of the common misconceptions people have about prenups? I mean, I mentioned one, it's only for the wealthy. What others do you see?
I think sometimes people assume they're legally binding. That's perhaps because in other countries they are. So in some American states and some European countries, a prenup is absolutely rock solid. It's going to be upheld. It's slightly different here, where the courts do maintain this paternal role, and judges can consider if it's fair and if they want to depart from that. So that's one misconception. The second is the cost. People will say to me sometimes, "Oh, I thought it'd be £50 or £100." Well, sadly not. There's a lot of work that goes into a prenup. Even where it's done quickly, it's weeks worth of work, not sort of minutes or hours. And so cost is a misconception. I think the time required as well, it is a misconception. Sometimes people call us weeks before a wedding. They want it putting together in order to obtain disclosure, draft the agreement, negotiate the contents. In some cases, it's going to take several weeks, probably a couple of months. So that's a classic misconception.
And what advice would you give to anybody who needs to approach what's considered to be a bit of a delicate and unromantic topic before a wedding?
Absolutely. My advice in a nutshell is get it done quickly, because once that's out of the way, you can focus on the nice things, the arrangements, the sort of dress, the rings, the honeymoon, and so on. So don't leave it too late to the too close to the actual wedding event. I would say ideally at least 3 months before, 6 months ideally. No point doing these things years before the event, it defeats the object. But certainly where a marriage is contemplated or even bought, don't leave it less than 3 months, I would suggest, to get the prenup underway.
Okay. And I guess you'd encourage kind of open and honest communication about why you would want to do this, for all of those reasons that you've given earlier on in the conversation.
Well, that's right. In fairness, when I've been approached, those conversations have taken place already. So people tend to come to us having had that difficult conversation. I've accumulated wealth before we met. I've got children I want to look after, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And so I think those conversations do tend to take place. But if they hadn't, I guess it'd be a fairly short conversation. Before I take any steps on a client's behalf, I'd urge them to talk what they want to achieve, and you'll soon understand if that's agreed or not.
Yeah. Do you discuss, and I'm sure you do discuss with your clients, reasons when or why a prenup might be deemed invalid or unenforceable?
Absolutely, because a big part of the job currently is actual litigation. So going before judges, seeing how they apply the law and how they can, govern the distribution of assets. So we have to say to people what judges will tend to consider when looking at settlements, whether they're in a prenup or in the event of disputes later on. Again, I think needs is a key consideration. If someone came to me and said, I've got £400,000 worth of assets, I want to protect the lots, I don't want my spouse to have anything in the event of separation or divorce, my advice would be, well, that's very unlikely to be upheld, because the judge's first consideration will be, where is your spouse going to live? If they don't have their own resources to buy a property, they're going to need to share some of the assets, if not all of them. So needs is the sort of buzzword here, I would say.
Okay. And can these agreements be amended or updated after they've been signed? And I assume there's there's a procedure for doing that.
Yes, they can. We encourage reviews. A good prenup will contain a review clause, so it will sort of not force but encourage parties to review them after a particular length of time or when circumstances change. The key change is children. So if a young couple comes to us wanting a prenup, that can be done, of course, but we'd strongly advise they review it once children come to the fore, because it changes things massively. It's going to impact on housing needs. Perhaps one party or both parties will reduce their working hours, sacrifice their career. That will impact on incomes and ability to obtain mortgages and rent in future for housing purposes. So certainly the birth of children or more children should be cause for review. Other things may change. Inheritance can be received by one party later in a marriage they may want to protect. That would be another classic reason to review a prenup. So short answer, yes, they should be reviewed as time goes by, particularly when key things happen in life, children, inheritance, and so on.
And what role do you play then in the drafting and negotiations of these agreements?
I guess it could work both ways, but typically I seem to be the one drafting the prenup lately. The last few I've dealt with, I've been sort of the lead solicitor effectively, where we're preparing the documentation, collecting the disclosure, and then negotiate with the party solicitors to make sure it's mutually acceptable. But it's really a sort of planning role, I would say. We're sort of helping people put their wishes into effect, as opposed to the uncertainty of litigation, where a judge will ultimately decide what's going to happen. Personally, I prefer this role. I prefer helping people come through an arrangement than navigating the sort of guesswork of the court system.
And a final point, really, Stuart. Do you see any future developments or changes in the law surrounding prenup agreements?
I think there's got to be. I think England and Wales have always been slow to catch up with other jurisdictions in certain areas. And as I mentioned before, the legal system in other countries will very much promote prenups, and they are legally binding. That's it, end of. So I think there's a way to catch up in this country. Yeah, I think that's all I'd say on that point, Joe.
Okay, well, Stuart, thank you very much for your insightful responses today.
Pleasure, thank you.
And for anybody listening, if you're thinking about getting married in the coming months, please contact us today. Have a discussion about prenup agreements, see if we can help you. And all the details of how to get in touch are on our website at mandahadley.co.uk and with the notes that accompany this podcast. Stuart, thank you.
Thank you.